We'll take you live across town to the American Enterprise Institute, a discussion that's underway for a few minutes now. The Dalai Lama, part of a panel looking at the issues of free market economics and happiness. Also on this panel is the former chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, Glenn Hubbard. It's live here on C-SPAN 2.
So, more natural disaster, I think, come. Then also, the population increasing. So there are, I think, not like ancient time. Ancient time, firstly, American native people, they remain peacefully. Then some people come from outside. Okay, still, America, I think, like multiracial, multiracial like that, and build this new wonderful nation. But more or less, you see, in America, south and north is surrounded by sea. So safe, not much sort of concern about other world. That situation completely changed. Now reality, east need west, west need east, south need north, north need south. South. So that's reality. So century-old thinking, we and they, is actually unrealistic. Now we must think entire 7 billion human beings, we must consider part of we. That's my fundamental belief. So, no problem. But the politicians, or whether you see a little bit sort of strange person, straight person, human being. Clear?
Clear.
So, the main purpose, you see, we have to sort of look seriously about the future of humanity. At least this century. Now we already enter 21st century. Now remaining the century, I think like past 20th century becomes something very, very the turning point century. Now this century also, you see, should be. So in the past century, a century of violence, century of war. Now this century should be a century of peace. Peace not come from sky. Since the violence we created, so peace we must create it. Peace only come through our action, not through wishful thinking or prayer. I'm Buddhist in my daily life, about 4 or 5 hours. Prayer, meditation. But all your wish will materialize through prayer. I don't believe. Buddha, as a Buddhist, Buddha emphasizes your action is the most important. Buddha cannot give you what you want. You must make effort. So the Buddha says, you are your own master. Of course, then, those believers believe in Creator. So wonderful. Some my friend, since we all created by God, so we all have sort of some kind of spark, right? Spark of God. So that sort of concept really gives us courage, self-confidence. And then, what is the nature of God? Infinite love. So if you really believe that, you must be more compassionate person. Nobody say Creator is full of anger. No. Full of compassion. So Creator is such. So therefore, we creatures, you see, must, you see, follow. You see, Creator's or what's it?
Example.
Example. So wonderful. But then non-believer, whether we believe religion or not, we are human beings. Biologically, we equipped it human affection. And also everybody is to come from our mother. So in our life, the beginning of our life, the mother's affection is so important. I always telling those people who received maximum affection during childhood, early period, early life.
Age.
I think in deep inside, much happier than those individuals who early sort of age, lack of affection from parent, particularly from mother. Then I think that experience remains whole life. So in deep inside, some sense of insecurity. So in any way, so believer or non-believer, we all have the same potential becoming more compassionate person. So our life starts that way. Now, for that, I think our scientists sort of friends, I think through their own sort of experiment, they have to say more things to say. So I also learning from them. So I'm looking forward to our discussions. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Holiness. We're going to turn now to our panel to provoke some of the wisdom of His Holiness on the basis of what their work is showing to them today about our economic system, about the world economic crisis, about the morality of our system, and a better world. And we're going to start with Glenn Hubbard. Glenn Hubbard is the Dean of the Business School at Columbia University. He has been the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under President Bush. He has held a number of distinguished positions and is the author of many books. Glenn Hubbard.
Thank you very much, Arthur. And Your Holiness, I know I speak for the entire audience, and we're grateful to you for this engagement. And Arthur, I'm grateful to you as well, because frankly, your work is taking economics out of the dismal and bringing it back to happy. So that's a good thing. I wanted to talk about really a five-step argument that I have made, at least in my professional career and research, for the morality and economic success of the free enterprise system. My charges in the university are largely young business people, but I confess to you that my favorite teaching is to slip into freshman principles of economics and talk to the youngest students. And I always say to them, I'm coming with two questions, and they were the questions that drew me to economics. The first is, why isn't the whole world rich? It's a very deep question. It's easy to say. And the second is, what could we do to achieve mass prosperity in any society? And I tell them, if they hang with me, we'll answer those questions together. The first point I wanted to make was that free enterprise economies have demonstrated both absolute and relative success in both generating prosperity and alleviating poverty. Economists will tell you that the first, second, and third industrial revolutions were made possible by economic institutions, by the support of property rights, and the defense of individual economic freedom. We've seen that extreme poverty alleviation in China, in India, in sub-Saharan Africa has been made possible not by government action, but by an opening of markets and the restoration of individual freedom and commerce. And on the negative side, we of course have the spectacular economic failure of the Soviet Union's collapse and the clear case study of North Korea's ongoing failure, having started essentially in the same place as South Korea. Second point I would make is that free enterprise is critical for the economic success that can fund both the market goals that many in this room work on and the very important social goals that His Holiness brought up in his remarks. Entrepreneurs are not people who are directed. They are people who have an uncoordinated search for opportunity. And market-oriented financial systems do two great things. One, they advance prosperity by investing in firms that become successful. And frankly, by allowing weak or outmoded firms to fail, they advance society. This is about dynamism. Economists often talk about creative destruction, the new replacing the old. But I like to talk about non-destructive creation, brand new things that create visions. That is the source of innovation and wealth. It's also about happiness. My Columbia colleague and Nobel laureate in economics, Ned Phelps, has noted many times that satisfaction in an economy is highly positively correlated with measures of its dynamism. Third point is that I have many concerns for statist economies today. The lack of incentives for innovation, for entrepreneurship, leave both consumption possibilities and living standards lagging. Traditional approaches to foreign aid in those societies relative to encouragement of business or of entrepreneurship have largely failed. And large government roles invite rent-seeking and corruption. And by the way, that is a lesson that this country needs to take heed of as well. But I would also say that capitalist economies face a number of cautions. We have been very good at generating average growth, but not everyone is average. Economic inclusion, by which I would mean the ability to obtain meaningful work, is an objective that has to be maintained with dynamism. A social safety net is important, but what's all the more important is the ladder to get to work. Work is the symbol of advancing economic mobility. It's also the symbol of advancing social mobility. And free enterprise societies need to contemplate a Marshall Plan almost within themselves to advance the work opportunities of the least well-off. The final point I would make is that while economists like myself often talk about economic efficiency or prosperity in economic terms, I think one can go back to Adam Smith and classical writers in my profession to make the defense a moral one. Smith called natural liberty the power to buy and sell, take or leave a job, and make a deal with whomever you like. That's not just a feature of commerce. It is a feature of a moral society. Dignity is also a symbol of a free enterprise society. Markets promote mutual respect for each other's talent, for each other's energy and hard work. Arthur has said many times, and said it well, that earned success, or the fruit of your own creativity, is an important moral and satisfaction objective, not just about GDP. And I would leave you with a couple of thoughts. Free enterprise societies tend to be societies that have more dispersed power. The power is spread out evenly in the population and not with a single controlling government or central planning. Central planning systems are less likely to reform, to adapt, to be present in the modern world, and a free enterprise economy has that natural buffer. To close where I began, our goal ought to be to celebrate the success of free enterprise economies, but stretch that goal of success to an idea of mass prosperity. I think that goal is morally right. I also think it's economically achievable.
Thank you, Glenn Hubbard. Your Holiness, Dr. Hubbard has told us that the free enterprise system is naturally the most moral of economic systems, but that we have much more to do to include more people in its blessings around the world. Do you agree with this? And how can we make it more effective?
Yes, I think. First, when you mentioned the 가서다 죽선에 믿고 전부 믿고 제목이야 스톱송. 참 충분해 들으셔요.
So, His Holiness was interested by one of the questions that you asked your students. One was why.
I mean, you mentioned
why
at the beginning.
Yeah, why aren't everybody rich? why haven't we been able to make everybody rich? So His Holiness was wondering, what sort of criteria are you using there in terms of someone being rich?
All I meant by the statement was the idea that why isn't the whole world as prosperous as the most prosperous countries? So why is it that the United States is a rich country, but other countries are not? What is it? It's a hard question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I when you use the word rich, as if you sort of, because of that meaning rich, a billionaire, then impossible. Everybody become billionaire, impossible. Then perhaps a millionaire, I think difficult. So at the basic, the basic point, yes, every human, also the because of the activities, it's the individual
Initiative.
because of the initiative is very, very essential, as I mentioned before. So therefore, I think the whole world witness centralized economy, no matter how much the effort fail, former Soviet Union, and then also we look at China. So then, you see, they compel to follow more new sort of pattern. But that's more or less the capitalist system. I think Deng Xiaoping, very, very realistic leader. So he accepts the reality. So he has the courage, you see, to change the economic system like that. So that really brought a lot of sort of prosperity or economic development. It's clear. At the same time, the capitalist country, United States, most richest, but gap rich and poor, also you see quite big. So nowadays, I usually have some kind of headache. I don't know you see these things. India, during Pandit Nehru, see, he emphasized democratic socialist sort of country. A little bit sort of control by the government, not very successful. Then some change, it helped. So that is the fact. Reality shows, you see, the just socialist sort of thinking also is not because of that.
Efficient law.
Not efficient, and it just simply you see the capitalist way. Also, you see there are drawbacks. So now we have to sort of find more sort of the experiment or discussions. That we need more sense of concern of others' well-being, as I mentioned before, and finally, sense of humanity, concern of humanity, on the basis of sense of oneness of humanity. Then, of course, all our activities with that kind of sort of motivation, then everything become constructive. I think if there is some sort of little sort of because of the negative side things happen, then immediately pay attention and change, modify, isn't it? But I myself, I don't know. Unless I spend, you see, I think at least a few years study about world
Economics.
And become student of you. Otherwise, it's impossible, you see, to make so precise sort of comment these things.
Thank you, Your Holiness.
I see the beginnings of a joint op-ed here.
We turn next to the perspective of business. And Dan Loeb, who's the founder and Chief Executive Officer of Third Point Capital, which is a hedge fund deeply involved in the finance system here in the United States. He has done work on both Eastern and Western thought and practiced it extensively in his own life. He's going to give us his perspectives on what we see in America's business community today. Dan Loeb.
Thank you, Arthur. And I just want to say, Your Holiness, it's an incredible honor to be here with you here today, the spiritual leader of the Tibetan people. I grew up with my dad, who would have been about your age today had he still been alive. And he'd be so proud to see his son up here with you. It's really incredible. I carry that spirit with me. It's also incredible to be here with the spiritual leader of the capitalist people, Arthur Brooks. And it's a profound honor. I'm not sure my dad would be quite so proud of that, but he'd certainly be happy. So I started my fund in 1995 with $3 million under management. We've grown a bit over the years, but I started in June of that year, and I started practicing yoga, Ashtanga yoga, a few months before that. In fact, my yoga teacher, Eddie Stern, is here in the back of the room. And about 5 months after starting my business, fiduciary, I had other people's money under management, my yoga teacher convinced me to go to India to study yoga with a master of Ashtanga yoga, Pattabhi Jois, for a month. And it was an unusual decision. In fact, I got a call from one of my friends, a competitor in the business. He said, "Don't do that. That's a huge mistake. Everyone's going to think you're a flake for leaving your business, going to India, studying yoga for a month." And remind you, there were no internet connections then. Cell phone service was non-existent. But his concerns were well-founded. So I went anyway. I had a great month there, and it launched me into really a lifelong passion for spirituality, for contemplation, meditation, and I just want to say that contemplation and meditation, these things, they're not just for monks and for hermits. They're really for people. I think it can really improve all of our lives, and it can really improve us as business people as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some specifics around that. I'm going to talk about how contemplation makes us better decision makers, and why that's important in our system. And then I'm going to close talking a little bit about my experiences on the front lines of the financial markets and how this all kind of goes together. So just a couple quick lessons from yoga for me and why it's been crucial as an investor in being a better decision maker. One of the first lessons you learn in yoga, I think it was in the Yoga Sutras, it says, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which means yoga quiets the fluctuations of the mind. And I think this is consistent with what His Holiness says, that you can't be a happy person if your mind is not at ease. The second thing that's very important that we learn from yoga is to put ourselves into difficult positions and to be able to create a sense of equanimity in those difficult decisions, in those difficult, situations, so that you can persevere and emerge from those situations making good choices. I was with a Navy SEAL last night, and he told me about his BUDS training and how it forges them like steel. Now, that's probably the appropriate training for someone who's a warrior, but certainly in life, there's other types of training, and certainly what the Dalai Lama teaches and what I learned from yoga is applicable for all of us to be better decision makers. Now, it isn't just a question of getting to the right outcome. One of the other things that we learn from yoga, and this is in the Upanishads, is that life in the Upanishads is described as a wheel with many spokes that come out of it. And at the center of it is your heart, which should be your moral grounding. And I think for all of us, certainly for all of us in our society, that is critical, is that when we make choices, they come not just from a standpoint of what's going to create a favorable outcome, but as the Dalai Lama said yesterday, make sure that we make decisions that do no harm. Make sure that we make decisions that are consistent with our moral framework, whatever that might be. So, so how has this helped me as a business person? So, on the one hand, we have I look at like 3 types of decisions that we make. One is the very core foundational decisions, which are easy. You're honest, you don't hurt people, treat people as you would like, whatever your framework is. The second are decisions which we can turn to a framework. It might be in sports. You're going down a hill. You know that there's a framework for how you ski, bend your legs, distribute your weight a certain way. Or in business, you may have things that you've seen time and time again, and you can do things consistent with that pattern. And then there's the third type of decisions. We all have them in our own world. For me, it's trading decisions. There's some of them they might fall into a very consistent pattern that we've seen before, but a lot of times it's just all new territory for us. And that's where this practice that enables us to be more creative, to be intuitive, to make these better decisions is really important. So why am I spending all this time talking about decision making? We're really lucky. As the Dalai Lama said, we live in a system that favors the individual. Not all systems, not all countries give us those choices. Glenn talked about the dispersion of power. That's key. Having a system in which power is dispersed and pushed down to the individual makes for a more effective country, it makes for more effective organizations, and it's really important. But you also have to trust individuals to make good decisions. So I'm going to pivot here to capital markets and why this relates. Well, obviously, I'm in the business of making many decisions all day long about people, about markets, about stocks, about all kinds of different things. But I want to talk about the markets themselves and how they relate to this discussion of prosperity and flourishing, and why the markets actually make the world a better place. I think there's a common view that financial markets are good in the sense that, well, if somebody has a new idea and there's a venture capitalist, they can invest in the idea, and that man or woman can create a business around that. There'll be innovation and growth, and new things will come. You'll get iPhones out of that type of system, and you'll get medical advances, and everything from FedEx to you name it are businesses that have been started from this type of framework. And that's key. And I think everybody kind of appreciates the importance of a robust venture capital market, IPO market, for that to happen. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Without a system that also provides for credit, that's another part, because once you've started your business, you need credit. But you also need this. These shares don't come out of thin air, and credit isn't issued out of thin air, and it's not just by banks. Institutions run by people make decisions to invest in equity, to invest in credit. So we need a couple conditions for that. One, we need robust financial markets where there's liquidity, and so that person who invests $10,000 or $20,000 or a few $100,000 in that startup knows there's the potential for the IPO and for it to go public. And down the line, the person who buys those shares needs to feel comfortable that there's rule of law and there's corporate governance. And sometimes these things people look at these things in isolation and they miss the importance of all of this. And this is key. I'm going to talk about 2 key concepts. One is liquidity, and one is the availability of low-cost capital. And those two things are critical ingredients to the system that we have. And they only exist if you have the rule of law, and if you have people that feel confident in the system that we have. So sometimes you'll see situations where creditors are treated badly, and you might feel like, well, who are those creditors? They're a bunch of vultures. They really don't deserve to get their money back. Let's just change the rules now. And you might say, well, those are unappealing people who are buying the credit. Let's just hang them out to dry. The problem is that the people who suffer are not just the investors in that particular credit situation. It's the entire system, because the entire system relies on the rule of law and the dependability and the knowledge that if they don't get their money back. There's a system where they can rehabilitate and restructure whatever it is that they've invested in. There's also the benefits of people who invest their capital. They're, for example, the people that invest, on whose behalf we invest, the pension plans, the retirement funds, individuals who are providing for their future. So you know, it's a great system. There's no other system that can create the sort of prosperity that we have, the kind of innovation. It isn't perfect, though, and there are folks left behind. So I just want to close by saying what Glenn had mentioned how important it is, like we should have a Marshall Plan for this. The most important thing I see out there is education to get people included in the system. And you know, for me personally, my philanthropic energy is directed towards how do we get a broad base of less privileged people, folks that have been, kids and families who have been written off by the system. I'll tell you one thing, it's a myth that poor people can't learn and can't achieve at the same level as white rich kids. You know, we have a school, I'm on the board of Success Academy Charter Schools. We have a school in the Bronx, in the poorest congressional district in the country, where our children just scored #3 in New York State out of 3,528 schools in math, and 1 and 2 were gifted and talented schools. So it is possible. We need to work hard on educating kids. There's a lot of things. We can all do different things. Mine is education. I think that will help. We need a great safety net, but we need to, as Glenn said, bring as many people as possible into the system so they can all flourish along with us. Thank you very much.
Your Holiness, Mr. Loeb has covered a lot of territory, but one of the things he talked about is that for the free enterprise system to create blessings for the most people, we require government regimes that protect the property rights of individuals. I know you travel all over the world. You talk to people in oppressed countries and in free countries. What do you think that our nations can do more to protect the property rights of individuals so that our systems can bring more poor people out of poverty?
See, your presentation, it seems, I think, as you mentioned, was quite more holistic. Comprehensive. Wonderful. I think basically, things are interconnected, interrelated, interdependent. So if something independent, then we only is concerned about that. Usually we call expert, only that thing. But the reality, everything is interrelated. So the proper way is to pursue that. We have to sort of look more holistic.
From a larger picture.
Larger picture. So now here, firstly, I think individual initiative. That also entirely depend on their self-confidence. Self-confidence also sometimes blind over self-confidence. That is dangerous. So education also is a more holistic education. Then, as you mentioned, I think the whole system. I think here, the judiciary system, rule of law, very, very important. In any way, among people, some little bit sort of strange people or wicked people, so the protection from law. So all this, I think the combinations were.
So you can see many factors that are really intertwined.
Then, as is both, I think, mentioned, the trust.
even in the business field. Ultimately, trust, important. So trust very much in order to develop trust, honest, truthful, transparent, very, very important. So in this, in that respect, I think the more self-centered attitude, then some sort of they're always possible to develop differences or gap appearances in reality, saying something nice, but thinking something different. Then immediately destroy trust. So honest, transparent. So long you really take care about others' well-being, there's no room to cheat, because you take care about their well-being. So here, ultimately, see, all these things are depend on rest of the community or rest of the the group. So therefore, trust, very, very essential. Trust, first, you see, you remain a strange person, and hoping more trust from other is illogical. First, we must sort of show sincerity, honest, truthful. So this cannot be produced by machine or drug. But through, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the human nature, affection, sense of human brotherhood, sisterhood. Biologically, potential is there. Now, through education, further nurture these quality. That I really believe, you see, exists, as I mentioned yesterday, the existing modern education is something lacking in that respect. So we usually, when we when the point about love, compassion, these things, we always rely on religious faith. Some people, I think yesterday I mentioned, some people feel moral ethics must be based on religious faith. Then it becomes very limited.
No.
Like that. So after all, I think the for humanity, see, we really need more
universal
sense of universal responsibility and commitment. So wonderful presentation. Thank you. Now, after listen yesterday and also today, particularly today, I developed more respect about capitalism. Otherwise, this is my impression. Capitalism only think of money, then exploitation.
But we've learned from Your Holiness over the past 2 days that enterprise truly can be and should be a blessing in the lives of all people, especially the poor, but every single one of us in this room. Notwithstanding that fact, it will not be if it's not on the basis, if it's not executed and practiced on the basis of brotherhood, of compassion, and of moral living. And that's, of course, what we're learning from you these last 2 days. So our respect for capitalism was very solid coming in, but our respect for the underlying principles that can make it live up to its promise, of course, are coming from you. We move on now to Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt is a professor of ethical leadership at New York University's Stern School of Business. He's also the world's leading expert on the science of morality and has given these ideas from a moral dimension a great deal of thought. John Haidt.
Well, thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Your Holiness. This is such a wonderful day when a religious leader, revered religious leader, who is particularly beloved on the left, comes to a free market think tank, run by a man who seems every day to be arguing. Your most recent argument was that conservatives should start fighting for social justice. Before that, it was declare peace on the safety net. So this is scrambling all the categories. This makes me so excited that we might finally break out of the rut we've been in for so many years in our arguments about the role of business and government. In my remarks today, I'd like to tell you 3 stories about capitalism. His Holiness embraced the first story until, I guess, about 5 minutes ago. I just discovered maybe he's moving on to the second story, which was told by Glenn and Dan. And what I'd like to urge is that he then devote his efforts to helping us write the third story. So here they are. The first story is that capitalism is exploitation, and it goes like this. Once upon a time, work was real and authentic. Farmers raised crops, craftsmen made goods. People traded these goods locally, and that trade strengthened local communities. But then one day, capitalism was invented, and darkness spread across the land. The capitalists developed ingenious techniques for wringing more work and wealth out of the workers. They then sucked up all the surplus wealth for themselves. They used this wealth to buy political power, making the rest of us their pawns forever. The end. Now, in the wonderful recent book, Why Nations Fail, Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson show that there's actually a great deal of truth to this story in most nations and at most times. Economic institutions have generally been extractive, not inclusive and generative. This exploitation story activates many of our deep moral psychological circuits. One of those is that we judge people based on their intentions. And if people do something for us without intending to help us, we don't tend to give them much credit. This is certainly what happens to business people who enrich our lives. But are we grateful? Well, as Adam Smith put it, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, what's happening here? Let's see, let's be grateful for better technical equipment. Okay, it seems to be steady now, all right. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We may praise their skills, but we never praise their virtue. In fact, we see them as selfish. And this, I believe, is the view that His Holiness held, again, until 5 minutes ago. I first met His Holiness at the University of Southern California 3 years ago. And at that time, at that conference, I asked him, what kind of government would you like to see in Tibet? If you could advise on a new government for Tibet, what would it be? And his response was this, quote, between socialism and capitalism, I'm a socialist. And furthermore, I always describe myself as a Marxist, but not a Leninist. In my mind, Marxism is the only economic theory that expresses a sense of concern about equal distribution, and that is a moral thing. Whereas capitalism is about how to make a profit, only that. And in order to get more profit, there is no hesitation to exploit. But what if we were to judge people and ideologies not by their intentions, but by their effects? Well, that would take us to the second story, which was told so ably by Glenn and by Dan. I can therefore abbreviate it. It might go like this. Once upon a time, and for thousands of years, almost everybody was poor, and most people were serfs or slaves. Then one day, some good institutions were invented in Britain and Holland, and these democratic institutions put checks on the exploitative power of the elites, which led to the creation of economic institutions that supported private property rights, risk-taking, and innovation. Free market capitalism was born, and it spread across Europe and to many of the English colonies. In just a few centuries, poverty disappeared from these fortunate countries. Not only that, but people got dignity and safety and longevity. Free market capitalism, in this story, is our savior, and Marxism is the devil. In the last 30 years, dozens of countries have embraced our savior and kicked out the devil. And if we can spread the gospel to the rest of the world, we will soon enter a golden age. The end. All right, so that, of course, was told much more ably and with much more detail by the two previous speakers, but I think it's important to note that these are sets of ideas that have been circulating through the intellectual class and through political discourse for centuries now. Let's see. Free markets really are miracles. I've come to see this as I joined the Stern School of Business just a couple of years ago, and suddenly I'm seeing how miraculous it is that you really can turn water into wine, vast quantities of wine at low, low prices, as long as the vineyard owners can get access to cheap credit and transportation networks and have property rights, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it really accomplishes miracles. But because free markets are so astonishingly good, people sometimes come to worship them. One of the basic principles of moral psychology is that morality binds and blinds. What this means is that when people come together around a shared worship of some sacred object, it makes them cohesive, it makes them able to work together, but it blinds them to the faults and flaws, it blinds them to nuance and subtlety. Pope Francis pointed this out in his controversial exhortation last November when he said, quote, he was criticizing those who embraced the second story. He said, quote, "A crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system." And this brings us to the third story about capitalism, which is a story that isn't written yet, but it's one that we'll be writing in the 21st century. It begins like this. In the 1990s, or once upon a time in the 1990s, capitalism triumphed over all other forms of economic organization, and the entire planet began moving towards prosperity. But we didn't live happily ever after. In fact, this period marked the beginning of a new chapter where we discovered a bunch of problems that we didn't really see before or didn't appreciate before. The gap between rich and poor within nations began to shoot up. Economic gains went mostly to the rich, who began increasingly to use their wealth to buy legislators and laws, just as was charged by the first story. The problem of global warming was first recognized. And just as Asia was beginning to industrialize, making it so much harder to solve and leading to apocalyptic forecasts of submerged cities all around the world. The crash of 2008 shook our confidence in capitalism's ability to regulate itself without strong government oversight. And as market values expanded beyond the marketplace into medicine and education and family life, many people began to feel somehow cheapened, as though something valuable had been lost. So this is our challenge for the 21st century. We celebrate the fact that more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in recent decades by free markets. Yet we know we can do better, as both of the prior speakers pointed out. If we can strip away the anger, the worship, and the ideology, we can look more clearly and openly at capitalism and its ethical challenges. And I take it that's what our panel today is really about. We can see that the supply chains that keep our shelves stocked originate in the dangerous sweatshops of Bangladesh. We can measure the polluted air and the empty oceans that we're bequeathing to our children. And we can have a more nuanced view of equality of opportunity, particularly here in America, where wealth buys your children a much, much better starting line in the race of life. So let us be grateful to the butcher, the brewer, and the baker, even when they are corporations. Let us look back in awe at the political and economic changes that brought us from the first story to the second story, at least in many of the most advanced nations economically. And then let us work together to write this third story, a story that must draw on insights from the political left and right, and that must draw on insights from secular thinkers and religious leaders alike. Is there a story about capitalism that could be embraced by Pope Francis, by His Holiness, and by the rest of this panel? Let's find out. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
第二步都是的 capitalism 去用途的开始。
Your Holiness, Dr. Haidt has told us stories about the capitalist system that are at odds and that they're common. All three are common in America today and around the world for that matter. And his conclusion is that the capitalist system can be the greatest blessing economically in the history of mankind, but that it has certain dangers. And these dangers come from ignoring, once again, as we've talked about again and again today, those who are being left behind. Now, we understand that in theory, but to understand in practice those who are more vulnerable than we are, those who are weaker, such that when each of us examines our conscience tonight before we go to sleep, we can say, did everything I did today help those who are weaker than me? Such that we can answer that question in the affirmative. What practical advice do you give us for helping the poor to enjoy the blessings of the free enterprise system that every person in this room is enjoying today?
I don't know. I am Buddhist. As I mentioned earlier, as my daily day practice for 5 hours, some meditation. The meditation means here analytical meditation. Analyze the ultimate nature of oneself and also the nature of phenomena, nature of whole world, whole universe, all these things. But that's also something typical about the Buddhist the practice. So not much, not relevant. Then these sort of complicated philosophical views, you see, finally, since the things are heavily interdependent, therefore, you see, for your own interest, you see, you have to take seriously about others' well-being. You see, taking care more about others is not selfishness. Best thing for your future. You see, taking care about others. Basically, we are social animal. One individual's future depends on the community. Community now, modern time, the community's future depends on the nation. The individual nation's future depends on humanity. So you see, use sort of our intelligence, the reality, then not blind sort of selfish way. But see, usually since many years I usually call, you see, we are selfish. It's very important for our own survival. Without self-care, we cannot survive. So therefore, but that you see, selfish should be wise selfish rather than foolish selfish. So many problems, we just think oneself and don't care about others' well-being. Ultimately, you will suffer. Taking care more about others, then you get more benefit. So that's I think, old major religious tradition, you see, talking that. The same message of love, compassion. And for different, these practice, message of tolerance, message of forgiveness. And also, you see, in order to sustain, go too much of the extreme selfish, or sort of now the greed, too much greed. Also, you see, they go extend. So therefore, practice of contentment. All major religious traditions, you see, talk that. Now I think, not just, you see, because of the related with, because of the concept of some mysterious things. Simply, our day-to-day life, or this very life, comfortable life, peaceful life, these are very much related. So now we need, I think, religious field, you see, in order to promote these practice, we are using some mysterious sort of things about next life or about sort of heaven, these things. Now we must find a way. Don't talk these things, but this very life, very world here. I think everybody is want more peaceful, more happier, more friendly world. Everybody, you see, agree that, isn't it?
Yes.
Nobody, I think, wants a nuclear weapon or war. Or even you see saying, you see the television, or bleeding, killing, dying. Our response different. Now, for example, I think response, one cup of sort of blood or cup of milk. I think my nature, the milk, blood, like that. It's basic our nature. So therefore, you see, these things, you see, everybody, you see, loves peaceful life, friendly to community. And we very much sort of appreciate, trust. Someone trusts you, you feel happy. And that also automatically develops some kind of responsible to help them because they trust me. This is our nature. Not come from religious faith, not talking about next life, not talking about heaven or hell, out of fear of hell. That is not very good. Through reasoning, thinking more about positive, then develop enthusiasm. Out of fear, some enthusiasm, not very good. So in any way, I think we can teach, we can educate people for best way to fulfillment of self-interest is taking care of the rest of humanity. I think modern education, I think modern day, I think education is so important. Now, through education, I think we can, because of the
bring these ideas.
We can promote the conviction about these values. It takes time, 10 years, 20 years. So that's my view. Whether realistic or not, you should judge.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot more in store for you, but I want to sum up in 4 points what we've learned from His Holiness this morning. And then I want to take a moment for some gratitude. The 4 points that we've learned from His Holiness on the basis of the wisdom that we've gotten from our colleagues here and his reactions are, number 1, each one of us, notwithstanding the differences that we have, including each one of us who's not even here today, those who are rich and poor in other countries around the world, each of us is 1 in 7 billion. And understanding our common humanity is the basis on which we can spread the blessings of all the things that we do. The second lesson that we learned today is that the free enterprise system that we came here to discuss is itself a blessing, but it has to be predicated on moral living from each one of us. The third is that moral living is a practice, and it's a practice of compassion and a sense of shared humanity. The fourth lesson is really the good news that we've gotten here today, which is that the principles and practices of global brotherhood and global sisterhood are in each one of our hands to practice and to teach, which is an affirming lesson and something that we can go away from this important session today in each one of our lines of work and everything that we do to make a better world. This is our charge, it's our privilege, this is our obligation in a very joyful sense. This brings us back to the subject of happiness, which is going to be our next session from our friends at the Mind and Life Institute. Now, a quick moment of gratitude. These programs that we've had over the past 2 days didn't come about spontaneously. They never do. We first have to start by thanking His Holiness's just amazing team, with special thanks to Chime Rinzing from Tibet, from the Tibetan administration, and from the Dalai Lama and his own administration. Is he here with us today? He's here. Thank you so much. Second, we have to recognize the Central Tibetan Administration, and especially the Sikyong, the Prime Minister of Tibet, Lobsang Sangye. He's not here. The Prime Minister is not with us today, as well as Kedor Aukatsang, who's with us here today. Thank you. AEI's collaboration with His Holiness the Dalai Lama came about because of the vision of Radio Free Asia. They contacted AEI more than a year ago with just the concept. Nobody had ever thought of this collaboration. They thought of that. We want to recognize them, particularly Libby Liu, the president of Radio Free Asia, and Calvin Lodell. The intellectual collaboration you're going to see here today is between AEI and the Mind and Life Institute. And you're going to be hearing from our friends at the Mind and Life Institute. We're going to follow up this program with their own session, Unlocking the Mind and Human Happiness. In just a minute, I'm going to turn the moderator's role over to my counterpart, Arthur Zajonc, another Arthur, who will be working with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and has done so for several decades. So I'll do that in just a minute, but we're so grateful to them for joining us and for their professionalism. Intellectually, this could not have happened if it weren't for Glenn Hubbard, Dan Loeb, and John Haidt. Our program today has been made possible by Third Point Capital and other supporters of AEI, including AEI supporters who are throughout the audience, our wonderful trustees, our scholars, and our staff, and our entire community. And especially today, my deep gratitude for all of his work for many decades that has changed all of our hearts is to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Thank you, Your Holiness. Stay with us. We're just getting started. Please stay seated, and we're going to change up the program and the audience.
The mic up? Great. Welcome to everyone to our second session. My name is Arthur Zajonc. I'm the other Arthur. I don't think you'll be too confused. Allow me to begin by thanking Arthur Brooks and the AEI for their kind invitation to join this distinguished group of presenters this morning, and also a very distinguished audience, in order to explore themes of deep importance and common concern. Your Holiness, as always, it's a great pleasure to also be working once again with you, as we have over many, many years. It's been a source of great happiness and flourishing, you could say, for us to be in dialogue with you for now nearly 30 years. Many of you have asked, what is the Mind and Life Institute? I think I should take just a minute to say a word or two about it. Back in 1987, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was joined by a neuroscientist, Francisco Varela, and a businessman, Adam Engel, in a kind of common interest and enterprise to join the best of the sciences of the day, what it is that neuroscience, physics, astrophysics, consciousness research could bring to the table in the conversations with the great contemplative traditions of Asia, traditions which also explored the nature of the mind and the nature of reality around us. And so those conversations would last 5 days. 5 days. You've got a couple of hours. Imagine sitting in this very small room, his living room, for 5 full days of dialogue on the most esoteric and interesting and important subjects of our time. Done not out of curiosity, but out of the conviction that ignorance is the source of suffering, and that if we can come together across normal divides, the schisms between science and religion, which go back centuries, if we can bring those broken parts together, then perhaps together the insights and wisdom will arise that really is necessary for our time today. We came together not out of just idle curiosity or only out of friendship, although those were also there, our interest in friendship in each other, but also our animated concern for the well-being of our both individual community and ultimately our planet. And so Mind and Life's work from that early beginning has spanned now nearly 30 years. In 2003, we made our first public offering at MIT, called Investigating the Mind, where we studied attention, emotion, and mental imagery. We did so with a full array of the world's most foremost scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and the like, and likewise, on the other side, the contemplative scholars and practitioners drawn from various traditions who could then work together in public around this same theme of bringing these two worlds together, a kind of undivided life for the first time. We've had 27 such dialogues, many in public, many still in private, and out of that have come over 15, I think it's now 18 books, 4 are still in production, a wealth of publications. But most recently, our work has also begun to take an applied turn. That is to say, not only are we looking at the basic research that underlies human well-being and flourishing, the alleviating of suffering, but actually Mind and Life has now begun to actually work in the fields, for example, of education, secular ethics, which is so close to your heart, working in the area of craving, desire, and addiction, working in the area of mapping the human mind, inviting visiting scholars into our Amherst College house, and working with them as well as with 150 young people every summer for the last 10 years. I mean, one thing after the next, and it's really flown from this very fertile dialogue with you, Your Holiness, and with the kinds of people you'll experience on this stage today. You know, when one begins a practice, a meditative practice, as Daniel Loeb said, we begin with an intention. What is our purpose in doing this? Is it selfish or is it selfless? Do we have in mind the connections, the compassionate connections between all of us that link us one to another? Again and again, His Holiness has re-articulated that interdependence as central to our ethical lives. I'd say this work, the work here we're doing today, must also likewise have that intention. And so we enter into this dialogue with good spirit. You've articulated the same kind of intention at the very close of your summation. So let us begin also the second session with the same heartfelt theme in mind. We're here because we care. We're here because we care. Can we care enough? Can we find the means and methods that we can care for one another? Let me introduce to you the people who are on stage with me. Dear friends all, of course there is Professor Richard Davidson, known to you for many years, Your Holiness, as a professor at the University of Wisconsin and the director of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds. He'll be leading off with a careful scientific treatment of the study of happiness and well-being, human flourishing based in the neurosciences and psychology and its implications for education. Our second presenter was for 14 years president of Wellesley College, Diana Chapman Walsh. Diana is also on the executive committee of MIT's board of directors. She was the founding board chair of the MIT-Harvard so-called Broad Institute for Genomic Research, woman of extraordinary leadership, in fact, chairing our leadership efforts, so-called Academy for Contemplative and Ethical Leadership at the Mighty Life Institute. And finally, we have an added new participant, Otto Scharmer. Otto works at MIT and is the founder of the Presencing Institute, and he'll be speaking to the themes of leadership, mindfulness, and the new kind of thinking that can work in the complexities of our contemporary society. I'll be acting as the facilitator, and it's a pleasure then to ask Richard Davidson to begin our discussions.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you again, Your Holiness. And I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Arthur Brooks and the graciousness with which the AEI has received us, and it's really been an exciting collaboration for us. So thank you. I'm here to talk about happiness and well-being, and over the course of the next few minutes, I'm going to make several distinct points about happiness and well-being from a scientific and particularly a neuroscientific perspective. So to begin with, scientists are now distinguishing among different components of happiness and well-being, different varieties of happiness and well-being. Happiness, the subjective sense of pleasure, we think now is something distinct from well-being, which we define more in an Aristotelian framework that has been described as eudaimonia, which is imbued with qualities such as meaning and purpose in life, having positive relations with others, having a sense of personal growth that is being open to change. All of these are constituents of well-being that have been studied in both the psychological and neuroscientific literature. And one of the most interesting conclusions from this scientific work is that the fleeting experience of happiness is subserved by different circuits in the brain than a more enduring quality of well-being. So that's the first point, that happiness and well-being are distinct. The second point is a point about genetics. And this is, I think, a very, very important point because I believe that modern research leads us to a different view of this. According to the most recent, very large-scale studies that have, these are studies that combine across studies. We call them in the scientific literature meta-analyses. These studies show that somewhere between 20 and 40%, as we say in science, of the variance, and I'll explain that in a moment, but 20 to 40% of the variance in well-being is accounted for by genetic factors. Now, what we mean by that is that differences among people in their level of well-being can be attributed somewhere between 20 and 40% to their genes. These are heritable factors. So what conclusion can we draw from that? Can we draw the conclusion that somewhere between 60 and 80% is changeable? That is the percentage that is caused by our genes something that is immutable, something that cannot be transformed? And here I would like to introduce the subject of epigenetics to the audience. And epigenetics is the science of the regulation of our genes. And epigenetics teaches us that each of our genes has a little volume control that can go from low to high. And that volume control affects the extent to which different genes are actually expressed, the extent to which genes manufacture the proteins for which they are designed. So we know, for example, that we can take an organism which may have a genetic propensity for anxiety based on its genes, and if it's raised with a mother who is very loving and very nurturant, the very expression of the genes that are involved in anxiety are transformed. So that it doesn't matter that there was a genetic predisposition for anxiety in that case, the environment has actually altered the expression of the genes which are critically implicated in anxiety and shift that regulation. And so from this perspective, the fact that a certain amount of the variance in our well-being is accounted for by genes really should not be a relevant consideration in discussing the potential impact of training and regulating the environment in its effects on our well-being. So what are the factors that can promote increases in well-being? Well, Arthur Brooks has actually talked about four, which I think are wonderful. And the four that Arthur Brooks notes are faith, family, community, and work, all of which I think there actually is substantial empirical evidence to show that they, in fact, do play a role in fostering our well-being. And from the research, the modern research literature, there are two particular factors that I would like to highlight. They're more granular, if you will. They all can be affected by the four factors that Arthur Brooks described, but they are generosity and conscientiousness. Generosity and conscientiousness. Both of these turn out to be very important in the fostering of well-being. And actually, His Holiness has written about secular ethics in several books, and His Holiness talks about the ethics of restraint, the ethics of virtue, and the ethics of compassion. And I think of conscientiousness as being impacted by the ethics of restraint, and generosity being impacted by the ethics of virtue and the ethics of compassion. And so I think that there is some interesting parallel between the Buddhist framework and the conceptions that we're coming up with in modern science. But I'd like to now turn to the notion that measures of conscientiousness and generosity and other factors that are associated with them early in life are very good predictors of an individual's development over the course of the early decades of life. Specifically, research indicates that a child's capacity for certain kinds of conscientious behavior when they're 4 and 5 years of age predicts outcomes when they're 30 years of age, major life outcomes, including economic success, but also drug abuse, physical health, and characteristics that are really meaningful for living a life that is filled with flourishing. So the question that we can now then ask is there a possibility through education to actually alter these qualities that are so central to well-being early in life? And here is where we appeal to the notion of neuroplasticity, the idea that the brain actually is the organ in our bodies that is built to change in response to experience and in response to training. And we know from neuroscience that there are sensitive periods in development where the brain is particularly sensitive to change. And we know that one of those periods spans the entrance into schooling. It's between 4 and 7 years of age. And so the question that we and many others and Mind and Life is taking on is, can we develop strategies, interventions, curricula that are targeted to this early period, which may then actually foster the qualities like generosity and conscientiousness, which are so important to flourishing over the course of development. And we're beginning to get an answer to that. And the answer suggests that there is absolutely no doubt that these factors can be educated. And they can be educated in part because of our understanding of plasticity in the brain. We can shape the brain during these early periods of development particularly effectively. In our own research, we have shown gains of 20% on measures of delay of gratification from a simple curriculum that we've introduced in the preschool period. And this measure of delay of gratification is an important element of self-control and conscientiousness. So we're led then to the conclusion, and I'll just summarize here. There are really 3 points, major points that I've made. One is that well-being can be learned. And from this, we should think of well-being and flourishing more as a skill than as a characteristic that is just fixed within us. The second is that from neuroscience, we know that the brain is particularly plastic during these early periods of development. And so we could take advantage of these sensitive periods to design interventions and curricula to educate these qualities, to educate generosity, to educate conscientiousness. And the third is that early interventions provide a great return on investment. And the Nobel laureate economist James Heckman from the University of Chicago has calculated that for every dollar that we invest in the preschool period, there's a return of $7 on that investment by the time the individual is 30 years of age. And so I believe that this is an issue that all of us, from all political persuasion, should get behind and establish universal education during this period of time where we can really educate the heart in ways that will make a fundamental difference when children develop. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Holiness, we'd like to take a few minutes to pose a question that draws on what it is that Richie just spoke about. He speaks about the benefit of education and training of those qualities and characteristics such as generosity and conscientiousness and compassion. Could you speak from your perspective, from this perspective of a practitioner yourself, what kinds of education and training would you recommend be adopted in order to promote just these qualities in children and young adults?
My longtime friend, you mentioned, you see, because of that, 지가 level 숭이 돼야 되고 춘주 것도 돼.
So Richie mentioned about the sensitive period of 4 to 7-year-old.
So I just want to know further more. My own case, I think 3-4 years is no interest about these things, and even I think 7, 8, around 10. You see, no interest. You see about so the inner values, these things. So actually, my daily lessons start more worry.
Classes,
Classes, like that. So great reluctance there. Then age 12, 13, 16, that gradually is more interest develop. So it's thinking, or the certain sort of idea mentioned in the text, and make relation with your own sort of the experiences. Then my age, I think late 20s and 30s, 40s, I think the more rigorous study and analyze contemplation. So really effect. So that means effect.
So the sensitive period doesn't seem to be limited to just to young early childhood. It's only saying that even as a grown up, there seems to be hope.
There are other sensitive periods.
Now my age, you see, 79, nearly 79. But still, I sort of meditate, analytical meditation. So I think every day I meditate. Its impact remains whole day, whole week. So getting older, no hope, that I don't think. whole life, so long, human brain remain there. I think we can develop further. Well, what do you think? As a scientist now.
Yes, so there's no question, Your Holiness, that that plasticity is present throughout life. That's the great news. So it persists until we die. And there's good scientific research to show that. So although there are these sensitive periods, there still is plasticity. But Your Holiness, I know that on many occasions you have talked about the importance for you of the affection that you receive from your mother very early on in your life.
Right.
And that may have set the conditions which then allow you to study and to do the analytic meditation and contemplation once you're older. So that early sense of love and security may be important.
Right. Absolutely right.
Your Holiness, the curriculum and pedagogy that Mind and Life is developing has 3 modes of care. And the very first is this one, that we all of us have received care. In the early childhood, to remember the care that we have received and to honor and to appreciate that more fully is a way of deepening the appreciation and then the transformation so that we can not only care for ourselves but also ultimately care for others. So these 3 modes of care, of receiving care, self-care, and extending care to others, becomes then a curriculum and pedagogy that can be effective, we think, even at the early ages. I'd like to introduce our second presenter. Diana Chapman-Walsh, of course, is known to you as well. And Diana, I'd like to invite you to speak.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arthur. I am very happy to be here in this happy fest with Your Holiness in your company again. What a great pleasure it is, as always, to be with you. And this group of intelligent and undoubtedly happy people, buoyed by the clarifying insights that have emerged from the mountains of evidence that our friend Arthur Brooks has amassed and mastered and is spreading across the land. Arthur, your joy and exuberance over the past 2 days, I love. They are really infectious. So thank you very much for having us here. I also need to say that one of the things I've learned from studying Arthur Brooks's writings, including his op-ed piece in the New York Times, is that women are happier than men. So I'm very glad to be here on this stage as the lone representative of the happiest sex. I have come in the spirit of warm-hearted inquiry. Warm-hearted is a word His Holiness uses often and lives. I've come in the spirit of warm-hearted inquiry. I so admire in Your Holiness and have so relished in my encounters with you since joining the Mind and Life Board just 2 years ago. It's been an enormous privilege. Those encounters have demonstrated the power of a particular form of dialogue, and I think we're beginning to nibble at its edges here, a dialogue in which all are invited to come, prepared to learn, and potentially to be changed by respectful engagement with the other, and perhaps to emerge with ideas that are surprisingly new. That kind of discourse requires artfully designed containers with ground rules and touchstones and intentions that welcome honesty and vulnerability based on reciprocity and earned trust. This is a meeting of a less intimate sort, and so I bring questions for now, as you'll see. But perhaps we might hope in time to meet again for the deeper dialogue that moves minds and hearts. I hope so. I want to learn more about how Glenn Hubbard would mend the social safety net. More from Dan Loeb about how we can build on the success of the Success Academy and reintroduce the rule of law into our casino markets. I would like to learn more from John Haidt about his encouraging third story and ask him how deeply are we willing to dig beneath the symptoms into fundamental causes and really, really study the need for profound systems change rather than simply focusing on the symptoms. So thanks to all three of you for your extremely thought-provoking presentations. So my questions, I have many, but I'll just mention two for starters. First, what price do we pay in happiness when we focus too sharply on ourselves? His Holiness has told us that it starts with the self, with the individual, but it doesn't end there. We in the West are so preoccupied with working on ourselves that it becomes almost an end in itself. Could that be a distortion of thought, a psychological grasping, an inner materialism akin to the overheated outward materialism that surrounds us at every turn? What if the fundamental error is to seek happiness through accumulation of any kind, material or psychological? In October, I had the pleasure of of participating in one of those Mind and Life Institute dialogues that Arthur described to you in Dharamsala, the home of His Holiness. And we were there with an interdisciplinary group of experts on the topic of craving, desire, and addiction. An underlying problem we learned from the Buddhist scholars who were with us is that our human tendency to fill an uncomfortable emptiness by clinging to thoughts, feelings, things that are inevitably impermanent, as are our lives, is part of our problem. The struggle to come to terms with our mortality is the vulnerability that makes us human. If we seek happiness through acquisition of gadgets, prestige, advantage, then aren't we looking for completion outside of ourselves, seeking a permanence or a perfection that is never ours to attain? Can we learn to be more present to others, including those we most love, without possessing them? Can we love them for who they are, not for who we want them to be? My second question is related to the first. How much of this interest in individual happiness is a sophisticated diversion, a distracting overlay of a simplistic model of social action onto a complex world as we deflect our gaze from frightening signs of instability and danger? I can hardly bear to allow myself to imagine how our children and theirs, my sweet 5-year-old grandson, Sean, will look back years from now and make any sense of this moment in history when we had compelling evidence that we were doing irreparable harm to the Earth's life support systems and yet failed to mobilize to protect their inheritance. The head of MIT's anthropology department, a friend, Susan Silby, explains the error we commonly make when we look to individual agency, choice, and personality as the causal factors in a world that is far more accurately explained by social context, organizational forms and design, culturally structured opportunities and motives. An over-focus on individual cases, she writes, obscures the patterns among them and protects the grand narrative, the story we tell ourselves that our institutions are functioning well enough to meet our needs. From this perspective, as one example, instead of asking how the individual's experience of earned success at work conduces to personal happiness, we would widen the aperture and ask how the birth lottery, the economy, the educational and social structures support or undermine the individual's opportunities to experience earned success. And the panelists just before us alluded to those considerations. Think unemployment, for example, and 30 years of wage stagnation as the weakening of unions has denied workers the opportunity to bargain for decent working conditions and their fair share of the profits of rising productivity. We could argue even, I would assert in this place, that it's the unions, not the free enterprise system, that offer the freedom from wage slavery. Now, I know I won't get an applause for that. Many scholars working to shape what they call a new economy, many of them, and they're quite brilliant, and they are on the margins. They are not in the center of our academic bastions, where I have spent most of my life. They would place my questions squarely at the feet of the American free enterprise system AEI is here to uphold. They are asking, with Canadian economist Mark Anielski, quote, why does the capitalist process and system of economics, accounting, and politics continue to defend or ignore its many forms of social injury and ecological destruction? That's John Haidt's story number 3. I had a list here, a quick list here of some of those injuries or externalities. John spared me having to read it to you. He gave it to you himself. But I think we could say, and maybe he would agree, that Adam Smith might not recognize where we are right now as his version of the system he viewed as moral. If we're going to address these problems, these intertwined problems that we heard described this morning, we will need a new kind of leadership, and that's the second half of what I want to talk about this morning. A different kind of leadership in every sector of society. Next generation leaders who are equal to today's challenges in all their complexity, who are skillful at leading themselves with compassion and equanimity, with love. With love understood as connection, in the way Paul Tillich defined it, the unifying impulse, the recognition of our interweaving with all living beings. The primary message we have been hearing from His Holiness yesterday and today so very clearly, the transformative power of holistic and analytical minds that are informed by warm and inclusive hearts. Love. We'll call it love. Arthur Zajonc mentioned the Academy for Contemplative and Ethical Leadership that the Mind and Life Institute is beginning to design with strong encouragement from you, Your Holiness. Thank you for that. We held our first planning meeting just 2 weeks ago, and we see the way ahead for a safer and saner future in a leadership that's grounded in connection, in love. We want to explore how to sculpt leaders who are gifted in the ways of community and connection. Can we grow up leaders who lead from within, as Parker Palmer has written, who understand that they have a special responsibility to manage their own inner shadows, lest they cast more shadow than light on those around them? Ah, the rejoinder comes. These are times for muscular leadership. We are told to be afraid, be very afraid, and to place our fate in heroic figures, offering simple comforts. But surely these nervous times call for Einstein's new levels of thinking. The more urgently if we believe that we're entering a period of profound change. What kinds of people do we want leading our vital institutions through historic transformations? How do we want them to lead? What should we expect of leaders we can trust? We'll need leaders who can bridge and balance tensions without collapsing them, can hold contradictions creatively so that they open our minds and our hearts to wider syntheses rather than shutting us down. We'll need leaders that can hold contradictions between power and love. Power without love is reckless and abusive, said Martin Luther King in the last weeks of his life. And love without power is sentimental and anemic. The collision of immoral power with powerless morality constitutes the major crisis of our time. I learned while leading Wellesley College for 14 years that my power, the power of the presidency, existed for the essential purpose of enabling others to find their purpose, their authority, their self-authorship. And I learned that to achieve that, I would have to remain open to others in a way that is the essence of love, as the drive to sustain unity and maintain connection. I would have to respect the other person's reality, the other person's yearning, the other person's path of growth, to be open to influence back from others and their different realities. And this, in turn, taught me the value of diversity as a resource for learning. I learned to hold another tension there, too. This one was even harder. To honor my inner life in the face of all that was swirling around me. It took time and concerted effort to hone the skills to manage external realities and yet maintain a quality of attention in the present that could enfold past and future, embrace complexity, and help me try to meet each moment with equanimity. I didn't always succeed at this, far from it, but I learned to find my way back when I was lost and to know this quality of mindful presence as a capacity I wanted for myself and for my leadership team because I wanted it for our students. It's been said that this new generation escaping into social media as their world spins out of control is being raised on information without context, butter without bread, craving without longing. And yet we have good evidence, as solid as Richie's evidence, that today's youth are longing for more nourishing fare. The disciplines they will need in the years ahead are the ones we will all need, and they are a life's work, never fully mastered, always requiring conscious cultivation. We'll need the strength to stare down our demons of fear and despair so that we can engage the world with curiosity, opening our minds and freeing ourselves of regret, recrimination, and the defeat of shame and blame. We'll need to hear and tolerate the diversity within ourselves, to recognize our own inner voices, their cacophony in there, our own inner voices and identities and moods, to notice how fluid and ephemeral they are, so that we can see and appreciate differences in others and use the practice of self-discovery to move beyond ourselves. We'll need to move beyond dualities, beyond either or, and even beyond the simple corrective of both and. Move to true multiplicities of seeing and of knowing, multiple lenses that acknowledge how competing language games and inequalities of power create lived realities that never even intersect unless we stretch ourselves to try to bring them together. And as we stretch, perhaps, finally, we may find our path to happiness in our immense capacity as humans, under the right conditions, the ones of which His Holiness has spoken for his whole life. Our immense capacity as humans to find and awaken the best in ourselves and in one another, radiating outward in widening circles of compassion and care to the 7 billion human beings you hold in your heart, Your Holiness, and all the living beings with whom we share this planet. Thank you.
Your Holiness, Diana Chapman-Walsh has spoken about a new kind of leadership, a leadership that really is directed towards our future, a future which, on the one hand, is filled with possibilities and positive possibilities. On the other hand, also filled with dangers and jeopardy. You yourself have been a leader of a people, your country. You've been a spiritual leader for your monastic community. And you have become a kind of leader for the world community as a whole. Is there some way you could speak out of your experience of a leader who's combined these three elements in a way that might be of some value as we go forward? New leadership. I know you're a simple monk.
Actually, most part of my sort of life in exile as a refugee. So in a way, simpler.
Really?
I think.
Okay.
The, India is our now second home, last now nearly 55 years. So the government of India, very, very helpful, is very supportive. So then my own case,
Things that I need to do.
of course, you see the period in early period, you see, sometimes you see people a little bit sort of demoralized. So they give
Tibetan Islam.
Tibetan encouragement. So I usually just say self-confidence is something very, very important. I often use it telling one my story. One time in South Africa, the Soweto
Township.
town, you see, I met a local black family. So there, one young African, a black African, he joined that family and conversation. He introduced himself as a teacher. Then, as I always, because of the talking, the Africans, I mentioned, now you already got democracy, equal. The Constitution now gives you that. And now you mentally, emotionally, you see, should develop. Oh, we are same. Where is the white people, you see, can, because of that, can reach. The black people also can reach. So some kind of self-confidence and hard work was very important. I just mentioned that. Then he responded, oh, difficult. We black people, our brain is inferior. So we cannot sort of compete them. And I felt very sad. If that kind of mental attitude remains, they never can be equal. So self-confidence is so important. Then I explained him, no, if you ask one scientist, brain specialist, any differences, brain, because of difference of color. Nobody say, our brain, 100% same. And then I also mentioned our own case. Like that. When we have the opportunity, you see, we can be equal with everyone, anyone. Like that. And then a lot of sort of talk, explain. Then finally, with
a sigh of relief.
Then he said, oh, now he convinced we are same. So that moment, I really feel because of that tremendous
sense of relief.
Sense of relief. At least I helped, you see, to change one person's mind and develop inner self-confidence, inner strength. So the self-confidence is very, very important. Quite often, you see, poor people, outwardly, you see, of course, big differences, the richer family or richer community and the poorer. But if you look inward, same ability,
same ability, same potential. So you see, with self-confidence and hard work. In India or in Africa, so whenever I talk with poorer section of people, I always emphasize, you also have the same potential. Work hard. So early period, I simply they give some kind of encouragement. And then of course, maybe a little bit of the vision, right from the beginning. You see, many Tibetan refugees, they are expecting within a few years can return. Then I telling them, no, we should not think that way. I usually telling, hope for the best, prepare for the worst is something very important. So we carry it that way. Then, now, 55 years passed. New Tibetan refugee generations emerge. Second generation, now third generations. See, we have sort of separate Tibetan settlement and separate Tibetan school. All is helped by Indian government. So now, refugee community, as a refugee community, we quite well established. So then, meantime, right from the beginning, I fully committed about the promotion of democracy. Since my childhood, our old system, something wrong and outdated. So we must change that. Not just because of the decision, change by decision will not work. So step by step, work for democratization. Since 1960s, we start. Then 2011, 2001, 2001, we already achieved elected political leadership. Then my position is semi-retired position. Then 2011, I now completely retired from political responsibility. So, in meantime, so I take because of the responsibility. I take a lot of the effort to educate younger Tibetan. You see, our 1,000-year-old our knowledge, which come from India, knowledge tradition. I quite often challenging. Some Western author describe Tibetan Buddhism is Lamaism. It's totally wrong, out of their ignorance. And how I think the Tibetans themselves, in the public way, in the popular level, they very much respect Lama. Not much differences about their knowledge. So I think the impression of Tibetan, too much emphasis, the importance of Lama, not study. So I think the people eventually got the impression Tibetan Buddhism is something like Lamaism. So Lama have the final authority. Lama have some kind of freedom. That's totally wrong. So that's why I always describe myself as a simple Buddhist monk, just one of the Buddhist monk. According to our monastic system, 253 rules, right? 253 precepts. All monk, no exception, Dalai Lama, have to follow. Same way. And study, rigorous study. I think yesterday I mentioned, because I have the name Dalai Lama, remain in the ceremony.
I remain on throne. But as far as my study is concerned, same. So my tutor keep weep. No exception as a Dalai Lama or reincarnation of Chenrezig. They treated me like lazy student. I think very good. So therefore, I really emphasis study, rigorous study. Traditionally, 20, 30 years study. Memorize the most sort of important root text. Then explain each word according to the commentary. Again, is the Indian wrote by Indian masters. So that knowledge, now I notice, as far as Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist concept is concerned, I think a Tibetan study is best. I think we kept, intact over 1,000 years, the knowledge of Nalanda. So I asked this, my longtime friend, you say, whether my brain, something useful or sufficient sharpness or not. All this come from, you see, Tibetan study, which come from Nalanda. Yesterday also I mentioned it. You see, skepticism, not easily accept. Analyze, and look various factors that automatically develop holistic view. That brings realistic sort of view. Realistic view, then carry realistic action. Then a satisfactory result come. So these I felt very, very useful, and also there is some potential, can make a little contribution for well-being of humanity. Never thinking conversion, never thinking sort of propagating Buddha Dharma. I think our last many years, I never sort of mentioned about next life or certain Buddhist concept. We simply discussing about mind, about emotion, and how to deal this. Clear? So part of Buddhist science, not Buddhism, Buddhist religion. So right from the beginning, some considered people, use the word dialogue between Buddhism and modern science. And I say, no, this is wrong word. So our dialogue is science which come from Buddhist literature. So we can call Buddhist science or ancient Indian science and modern science dialogue. Science, not religion, not faith. So I think I may, because of the mention maybe, out of 300 volumes, which actually are text. So I divided. First, I felt the content of these 300 volumes, we can divide 3 parts: science, matters, and minds, or external world or internal world. That part is science. Not talking positive or negative, simply what is the reality that we can treat as a science. Then on that basis, Buddhist concept of impermanence, concept of interrelated or relativeness, these things. That's Buddhist concept of Buddhist philosophy. On that basis, Buddhist practice, training of mind, is to come. That part is Buddhist religion. So philosophy, no. Science and philosophy and religion. As far as now science is concerned, now last about 3 years, because of compiling.
Now we're creating a compendium from the classical Indian sources.
So now that already now completed, almost completed. So March we will finalize. Then immediately we start to translate. Translation, English translation, Hindi translation, Chinese translation. Then many of our friends, Mongolians, Koreans, and Vietnamese,
they also is ready, you see, to translate in Russian, like that. So therefore, that's my main job.
That's your main job.
Not sort of political thing or administration right from the beginning. You see, the appointed person, you see, they carry.
Yeah.
If I carry sort of administration, I think everything kasa.
Everything will be confused.
I think your thoughts are
that sort of otherwise sort of that's the my sort of what's the commitment. Go to different countries, different places, and showing my teeth. That's all. One time, the vice president, later is the Indian president, become president, the Kasa. Dr. Radha Krishna. Very good scholar, and modern education in Oxford, educated, and also great philosopher. So one time, you see, we together, you see, looking some picture, and everybody is smiling. Then he mentioned, we are appetizing our teeth. He mentioned that. So that's one of my job, like that. I think that job also, you see, quite useful. That job brings more friends, more smiles from others. Except in some cases. In Germany, I want to share with you, see, as a joke. You see, one time in Germany, you see, one function, I'm going there. Then, you see, because I was in the car.
Yeah.
Of course, as by my nature, whenever I see someone, I always smile. So that particular day, one quite young lady is coming. As usual, I smile. I think that lady got some suspicion. Why? This strange person in the car, this dress is something strange. So smiling. So I think she may got some suspicion and distrust. So she looks very negative way. Then I also turn. So not necessarily, not very sure. You see, give smile. Sometimes negative response. Otherwise, it's basically even animal showing sincerity. Animal, poor animal, no intelligence, very limited intelligence. They also respond.
Thank you, Your Holiness.
So only question, since many years, whether mosquito have the ability to show appreciation or not. Still, this question still remains.
Mosquito.
So, mosquito. I think more than 20 years. I ask quite often, you see some scientists. One occasion in Oxford. One great because the scientists or philosophers, because the professors in front line. So I asked them. Nobody answered. So now this is your work. You see, the tiny insect, which level, the brain size, you see, have the ability to appreciate,
show appreciation.
To show you see, appreciation. That's still I don't know. So answer must come from you.
We'll get working on it.
So you have to sacrifice more insects. Insects life, isn't it? To experiment.
So if I summarize.
Okay. Thank you. So sorry, I'm wasting your time. Sorry.
Not at all. I think concerning leadership, endurance, self-confidence, study, clarity of thought, and good teeth.
What a good thing. And the bold head.
Yeah. I'd like to pull our final presenter into the hilarity. Otto Scharmer, why don't you join us by presenting your thoughts, which will include thoughts concerning leadership and what it's called for. Thank you.
Your Holiness, Arthur, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my deep appreciation for being part of this conversation this morning. And I would like to add a few remarks on the beginning convergence of leadership, systems thinking, and mindfulness that we can observe in many areas today. I'm an action researcher at MIT. I spent the last 20 years of my professional work in the context of organizational learning, innovation, and change. And during that time, I had the possibility to work in a lot of on-the-ground change projects across cultures and sectors. And also had the opportunity to do research projects, among others, kind of interviewing 150 thought leaders on innovation, leadership, and change. And many of them were practitioners. So listening to, to the practitioners and listening to the experiences in the field, I would like to summarize my own learnings from that with 4 simple points that I would like to add to the conversation this morning. The first one is that there are 2 different sources of learning. Learning from the past and learning from the emerging future. Learning by leaning into, sensing, and actualizing emerging future possibilities. And when you look into my field, organizational learning, almost all the methodologies and all the kind of best practices that are done in consulting companies and so forth are based on the first learning model, the experiential learning model, which is basically learning by reflecting on the experience of the past. However, in working with leaders in business, government, and civil society, I noticed that more often than not, leaders are facing challenges that you cannot address just by reflecting on the experiences of the past. Sometimes the experience of the past that we have are not very useful. Sometimes the experience of the past that we have in a team, for example, is the very obstacle to come up with a new way of framing a situation. So that then led the question to me, is there a second source of learning? Learning by sensing, leaning into, and then actualizing emerging future possibilities? And if yes, how does it work? Which leads me to my second point, leads me to the process that I have seen being at work when these situations, learning from the emerging future, happen. So in order to sense, lean into, and actualize emerging future possibilities, leaders have to engage in a process that is moving through the following 3 stages. 1, after clarifying your intention, observe, observe, observe. Kind of go into a deep immersion journey where you go to the stakeholders and the places that can teach you most about the situation, and listen with your mind and heart wide open. Number 2, everyone coming back and sharing what they experienced, and then retreat and reflect. Allow the inner knowing to emerge. Kind of synthesize everything that you heard and connect that with your own deeper senses of knowing, with who you are and what the kind of change or what's the kind of story we want to be part of. And then when the spark or an inspiration of the future shows up, number 3, act in an instant. So not putting it into a long time planning process, but exploring the future by doing through rapid, small-scale experiments that generate feedback from other stakeholders. The third thing that I learned is that to do that well, for leaders to do that well, leaders have to engage in a new type of leadership work, which is an inner cultivation work, by cultivating 3 inner instruments of knowing, which are the open mind, the open heart, and the open will. What I mean with open mind is the capacity to suspend our habits of judgment and to look at the situation with fresh eyes. What I mean with open heart is the capacity to empathize, the capacity of looking at the situation not from my angle, but from the view of other stakeholders in that situation. And what I mean with open will is the capacity to access the deep creative and entrepreneurial core that is dormant in every single human being. Your Holiness, you were yesterday you said action is more important than praying and blessing. So this process that that I just outlined is basically trying to link these 3 by kind of linking contemplation, observation with rapid cycle action. There are many leaders today that, or there are several leaders today that embody these principles. Steve Jobs is who has been a practitioner, a mindfulness practitioner himself, is well known kind of for his claim that the only way to do our best work is by following your heart. Do what you love and love what you do. Another leader I learned a great deal from, the late CEO of Hanover Insurance, Bill O'Brien, kind of summarized his own kind of transformation, change experience as a CEO with the following sentence. He said, "The success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener." So what he meant is the success of what I do as a leader, as a change maker, depends on the inner place from that I'm operating. Depends on the quality of attention and intention that I bring into a situation. One leader that I see also greatly embodying these principles is Eileen Fisher, the founder and CEO of Eileen Fisher, a very successful women's clothing company, who not only, like Steve Jobs, is kind of using practices, cultivation practices herself as an individual, but who also, like Twitter co-founder Evan Williams kind of does in his company, introduces kind of mindfulness practices on an organizational level. So in Eileen Fisher, every single business meeting is at the beginning, there is a moment of mindfulness. So it's not too long, it's maybe just a minute, and it gives everyone in that meeting the possibility to connect with the present moment, with my own experience, and with what we are here for to do together, with my own intentions. My fourth and final point comes back, Your Holiness, to your various remarks yesterday and today when you talked about the larger situation, the global crisis situation we are in. You know, Diana also talked about that earlier, and other at the earlier panel, kind of other co-panelists. And you said everything is interrelated. And you also said that taking care of others is the best thing also for ourselves, for our own future. So it's not really an alternative. So my fourth and final point relates to the global pressing challenges that we face as a community today. I have been, over the past few years, been involved in multi-stakeholder work in education, in health, in business, in sustainability. And from my experience, the key leadership challenge in all these projects, in all these huge, in part very large multi-stakeholder projects, is the same. And it begins with the fact that no single organization, be it government or business, can solve the big challenges that we face in education, health, and so on alone. So we have a collaboration challenge, really. And in all these systems, what we need to do as leaders is something very simple, which is we need to bring together all the key stakeholders, including business, government, civil society, and we need to move them through a process where they begin to make sense of the larger situation together, identify some of the key systemic issues that we need to address, develop kind of, a vision and intention of better ways of operating, and then exploring that in small-scale, hands-on prototypes where we can learn from experience, and then scale what's working. So what I'm saying here is, Richie, you were talking about neuroplasticity this morning. And when you said that, I thought, well, what is really the leadership challenge today? Leaders are the stewards of the neuroplasticity of the collective brain, kind of that, should be switched on in terms of the collaborative opportunities that we need today across all the silos that our kind of current way of institutionalizing things has created. And that's really, I believe, kind of the core leadership challenge that we face, kind of how, what we can do to be good stewards of switching on of activating the neuroplasticity of the collective field of collaboration and interaction that we have. So there are many examples of that, including kind of the Sustainable Food Lab here in America with over 70 companies. In Africa, in a project that significantly improved maternal health with all the stakeholders in Namibia, and also kind of in Southeast Asia around the Coral Triangle Initiatives, which is convening hundreds of stakeholders from all three sectors to address the biodiversity and the marine sustainable fishing and food security challenges in the region and globally. And so in summing up, and in all these challenges, the fundamental challenge for leaders is the same, which is to move a system that currently interacts based on ecosystem awareness, which is a narrow definition of ecosystem awareness, that I'm only aware of my own kind of view of the situation, so a different way of operating where the interaction and the collaboration is based on a shared ecosystem awareness. And with ecosystem awareness, I mean an awareness that is focusing not only on my own well-being, but also on the well-being of all other stakeholders in the system. That, in my view, is the key leadership challenge today, and decides is the causal factor that determines the success, the quality of results that we generate in these systems. So in summing up, I tried to make 3 points. The first one is that there are two different sources of learning. Learning from reflecting the past and learning by sensing, leaning into and actualizing emerging future possibilities. Secondly, leaders, in order to activate the second type of learning, need to cultivate 3 new leadership capacities: the open mind, mindfulness, paying attention to our attention; the open heart, compassion; and the open will, which is activating the deeper creative and entrepreneurial core that is dormant in every human being. So, and the last one, the last point is that the number one leadership challenge, in my view, today is to shift the field of interaction from the current mode that is mainly based on ecosystem awareness, or a narrow definition of that, to one that's more based on a shared awareness of the whole, and that is designed to create results that address the key challenges that we face as a community. today. Your Holiness, my question to you is this. So we have seen many great examples of benefits applying the power of mindfulness and compassion as individuals. And yes, that's where the starting point is. But what we also see today is that we face major challenges that require to use the power of mindfulness and compassion also on a systems level, on kind of how we evolve the system as a whole. And I would be just very interested in your view, your thoughts, or your experience in that.
I think you know better. You already have experience. So my thinking is we are emphasizing the education. So that's the fundamental sort of the approach. The approach. I think people who never sort of experience these things, then all of a sudden, you see, they pursue them, do that. They're a burden.
It becomes a burden.
So, through education, I think like you see, they taking care one's own sort of physical
health.
For example, health. For example, the exercise or these things. From childhood, they sort of learn that, and then that become part of their
habit.
So these things, I think, should start, as you mentioned, from young age. That also not sort of something like imposing, but for their own interest. Even day-to-day life, student, you see, sort of with these sort of experience, much happier. Even among students, some quarrel, a few moments, fight, then forget. Isn't it? So you see, the student themselves, you see the benefit. See the benefit. So through that way, then grown, then eventually, you see, enter the society, and getting job, and eventually become leadership. Then I think real effect come. Otherwise, I don't know. Pockets here and here. I don't know.
Thank you.
So you know better. You're the better.
It's my impossible task to pull this all together in just a few seconds, really. You know, we've come together across extraordinary divides. We've come from the left, we've come to the right, we've come from the world of science, the world of contemplative spirituality, from the world of leadership and organizational and systems, redesign and reimagination. And we've entered into a heartfelt and fully open dialogue. To me, this is a kind of politics of compassion that does not recognize party lines, individual differences, but recognizes that we all care about each other. We care about this planet that supports our good life. You know, Mind and Life, and I'm sure AEI, and many people who may be hearing this from around the world on the web stream, are also united in this commitment and conviction to truly care for each other and for our world, to practice a politics of compassion, as opposed to one of division and argumentation. So it's been a great pleasure and privilege to be part of this conversation. Just as one sets an intention at the beginning of a practice so that it may be fruitful, not only for oneself, but for others, that selflessness, I always think one should practice gratitude and dedication at the end of such a practice. And perhaps this dialogue, we can also be grateful to Arthur Brooks and his staff for generously hosting this, to those sponsors who supported it, and of course to you, Your Holiness, for the courage and the inspiration to speak to all communities, to, even as a Marxist, to join us here, to learn something about capitalism, to critique to practice that dialogue with respect and good heart. And Arthur Brooks, I'd love to invite you up here to close the session for us as well.
Thank you, Arthur. And thanks to all of you. One person that we haven't had a chance to show a little bit of gratitude is Dr. Jinpa, the wonderful translator for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We've reached the end of our session, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama is off to bless others for the rest of the day today. As we close out the session, please just take a quick moment to stay seated as he leaves the stage. And I do want to reiterate what Arthur just said to all of you. The founding principle of the American Enterprise Institute is that the competition of ideas is fundamental to a free society. We learned here today from His Holiness the Dalai Lama and our wonderful colleagues, new colleagues from the Mind and Life Institute, that to consider differing ideas with an open mind and a warm heart is a real virtue, and it's a blessing to all of us. This is important because we've also learned some of the secrets to happiness. The secrets to happiness lie within, according to His Holiness and according to the scientific evidence, but we can also improve happiness in our lives and in the lives of other people through visionary institutions and visionary public policy. This is what we are dedicated to mutually. And I think that the most important point of all is the blessings that we all receive today. The blessings that we receive from open dialogue, the blessings that we receive from the human solidarity that's completely apparent in this room and that will continue as we leave today, and the blessing most of all from the wisdom of the most wonderful man that we have met in so much time, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Please join me in thanking His Holiness as we thank all of you and say God bless you and thank you.
You can see all of this morning's event online at cspan.org.